Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who have come here tonight expecting some kind of evaluation of the progress and assessment of the position of the arts in Australia relative to other countries, some kind of artistic report card, I fear you're going to be disappointed. I was allergic to pontificating pompous, over-opinionated expatriates filled with a superiority for Australia when I was living here, and I hope I'm not going to be a hypocrite tonight just because I'm living 17,000 kilometres to the north. Whatever else is said of us, Australians like to think of ourselves as people of action, direct to the point of bluntness, certainly unpretentious and down to earth. And at the risk of contradicting myself, you are not going to hear me recommend a series of actions, strategies or policies tonight that I believe are urgently needed in order to fulfil or even consummate a role for the arts in contemporary Australia. As the inaugural lecture of what I'm sure will become a most welcome addition to the public engagement with the arts in this city, tonight is an occasion for speculation. I want to explore the basis upon which we think about, plan and act on behalf of our culture. I want to understand what motivates our intentions as well as our actions, what assumptions, what premises, even prejudices, shape the ways we think about the arts and the role they play in our lives. A lecture entitled State of the Arts would seem to be asking for trouble, or at least a modicum of controversy. But hyperbole aside, I would like to suggest that any consideration of the arts should reveal something more akin to a state of mind, a way of being, a concept of existence to which the arts itself can contribute. And in the process, I hope to allude to a role for the arts as an indivisible, intrinsic part of our lives, that rather than as some kind of desirable extravagance. I believe that the arts are necessary and never peripheral. And as I hope to use the occasion of this lecture to probe, they should not easily be segregated or hived off from other fields of human endeavour. In fact, I would contend that the very process that encourages an extrinsic approach to different facets of human existence is itself part of the challenge we all face in our attempts to make better sense of the world around us. In this lecture, I will be investigating several areas in which the arts conspire with some of our intellectual and sensory faculties in both straightforward and unorthodox ways to create and shape our future. I am searching for ideas which place the arts within a central, if not exactly conventional, position within our society. What you're about to hear is in two parts. The first asks some questions about the ways in which we choose to define, measure, and ultimately value the worth of any individual in our midst. It is a discourse about evolving definitions of intelligence, creativity, and human capacity. The second part of this lecture relates to some basic assumptions we make about the nature and composition, the very fabric of our society. It seeks to draw connections between those designations of intelligence and creativity and society itself, how our concept of individual capacity is reflected, nurtured and supported in and by the institutions and organisations through which we express our collective values and ambitions. For sheer technological accomplishment alone, the achievements of European civilization have been staggering. Yet I am not the only one urging a modicum of caution and humility. Consider the words of the philosopher and critic George Steiner, who in his book In Bluebeard's Castle says the following: "Technical advances, superb in themselves, are operative in the ruin of primary living systems and ecologies. Our sense of historical motion is no longer linear, but as of a spiral. We can now conceive of a technocratic, hygienic utopia functioning in the void of human possibilities. Our planet is indeed shrinking. ecologically and metaphorically. The march of humankind is causing vast cracks of natural landscape, ecosystems teeming with diverse species, many of which we will never actually get to know, to disappear. Is it not the simultaneous tragedy of our times that every city, European, Australasian, American, is becoming a carbon copy of every other city, polluted, congested, unsustainable? When a rainforest is torn down, it is not just the ecology that is affected, the oxygen that is depleted. It is most particularly the human relationships with specific environments and places that are destroyed. The poetry and songs, the stories and rituals, the intimate knowledge alongside the memory of unique locations that vanishes too. We are both the beneficiaries and the victims of our actions, and most especially of our modes of thinking. I want to get beneath the surface of this particular conundrum. I want to explore some ways in which we construct a shared sense of reality, to engage with the patterns of thinking, the very processes of our own minds, to delve into the ways in which we conceive of our own capacity and intelligence itself. I suspect if I asked everyone in this room for their immediate reaction to the word intelligence, many of us would conjure up memories of psychologists and IQ tests, tests which focus exclusively on linguistic and logical, that is to say mathematical and analytical forms of intelligence, definitions which by their very measurement reveal as much about the aptitudes of those in control of the process as much as those being assessed. It is said that the medical discoveries of the next decades will focus upon a greater understanding of the human brain, with the field of neuroscience set to be an exciting, expanding new frontier of medical research. By far the most interesting and provocative ideas I have encountered recently on the broad subject of neuroscience comes from the psychiatrist and literary scholar Ian McGilchrist. He has written a book with a rather forbidding title, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Dr. McGilchrist has some pretty startling things to say about the human brain. He begins this magnum opus with a description of the differences between its right and left hemispheres, between the areas of this complex organ that to some extent control emotion and imagination, that is the right hemisphere, and the location of reason or rational thought, that is the left hemisphere. Yet he goes to considerable lengths to assert that every single brain function is carried out by both hemispheres. Reason and emotion and imagination depend on the coming together of what both hemispheres contribute. Dr. McGilchrist develops a powerful narrative about how each hemisphere of the brain produces a very different version or take on the world. The Master and His Emissary offers some powerful paradigms for how we might better begin to understand aspects of the most basic functions of our human thought processes. And it's extremely relevant to a lecture of this kind. In my limited experience, here is evidence from a leading medical scientist about the various ways in which we construct a mental image of the world and why it seems vital to achieve an equilibrium within the different components and great capacities of the brain that modern neuroscience is just beginning to understand as vastly more plastic than we ever imagined it to be. In a world so dominated by scientific and technological innovation, it is important to assert that there is likely to be no single way of thinking that alone encapsulates the essence of human capability. Beyond the world of science, the work of the educationalist Howard Gardner is especially illuminating. In his groundbreaking book, Frames of Mind, written as long ago as 1983, Gardner describes multiple forms of intelligence, not just linguistic and logical, but spatial, bodily kinesthetic, musical, interpersonal and intrapersonal, forms of intelligence demonstrated by architects and artists, sculptors, dancers, athletes and gymnasts, violinists, French horn players, actors, business leaders and even politicians. Courtesy of the work of Professor Gardner, the definitions of intelligence have suddenly become vastly expanded. He argues persuasively that intelligence is not single-minded, but multifaceted. He describes the need for multiple intelligences to navigate the complex challenges of the world around us. Gardner's work has articulated the crucial importance of sensory stimulation and engagement as part of the development of neural pathways in early childhood. But what lies at the core of these remarks is a search for an understanding of intelligence as a crucible to unlock resources of human potential and insight. And it personally helps me to explain just why I am an artist, and to propose a narrative which I hope is a potent alternative to a prevailing wisdom which relegates the arts far too readily to a subsidiary role in society. I am a composer. Sound and music are the prism through which I experience and make meaning of the world. I am attempting to do so at a time in history when one is overwhelmed by information, in an era where one's senses are deluged by an overload of mainly visual but also oral stimulation. As an artist, my relationships are experiential rather than theoretical or measured. I certainly share with scientists and philosophers a desire to make sense of my existence. It is just that my approach is poles apart. It is a fragile, highly intuitive process in which sensory acuity and memory are subtly intertwined. In his book, Material Thinking, historian and artist Paul Carter explores the thought processes that he has observed both as a critic and a collaborator as part of the practice of making art. He describes his ideas as follows. Material thinking occurs in the making of a work of art. It happens when an artist dares to ask the simple but far-reaching question, what matters? What is the material of the thought? To ask these questions is to embark upon an intellectual adventure peculiar to the making process. Critics and theorists interested in communicating ideas about things cannot emulate this process, this experience. They remain outsiders. My experiences as a composer closely echo Carter's thesis. When I write music, my mind is constantly searching for shapes, sonic shapes, rhythmic fragments and melodic phrases, which begin to be conceived in isolation and then in ever-increasing combinations and permutations until textures, patterns emerge and evolve. In my quest for ideas that bring the acoustic into some sort of equilibrium with the visual, the work of anthropologists Edmund Carpenter and Steve Feld have been a huge influence. Carpenter and Feld undertake research in completely different environments with one crucial similarity: the role of sound as the primary way of sensing and responding to those environments. Edmund Carpenter is a Canadian anthropologist who's worked closely over a number of years with the Inuit peoples, the indigenous populations to be found across the Arctic Circle, from Greenland to the far northern parts of Canada. For most of the year, this environment is snowbound. Navigating across its isolated landscape, the horizon barely discernible requires a completely different set of skills to taking a stroll along Swanston Street. A highly developed sense of sound and touch are more important than sight. To the uninitiated, this environment looks like a confusing white canvas. Only an acute sensitivity to the sound of the ever-changing direction of the wind, the constantly shifting texture of the snow, offers any hope of accurate navigation, of returning to a home. Steve Feld is an ethnomusicologist who has lived amongst, recorded and written about the poetry and music of the Kaluli people from Mount Basavi in the central highlands of Papua New Guinea. The dense equatorial rainforest of this remote region does not reveal a horizon. One navigates through the ever-presence of the forest canopy by relying on other senses, especially sound. In describing the way in which the Kaluli people relate to their world, Steve Feld has invented a rather ingenious term, acoustomology, meaning knowledge of the world through sound. I make these observations partly out of a deep concern that urban environments, which are increasingly indistinguishable one from another, are prescribing our potential and even our ambitions and creativity. I fear that for reasons of information overload, our ability to sense the world around us is somehow diminished. Indeed, there is some emerging research that points to a specific relationship between certain types of physical and sensual stimuli, which would suggest that our habits and behaviours can indeed exert a profound influence on our genetic makeup and our neural pathways. Such claims are to some extent still speculations. However, were they to be true, they would radically shift our understanding of the importance of environmental factors in relation to our cognitive existence. The most enlightened attitude we can adopt in relation to a definition of intelligence and human capability is to treat it as an evolving entity. I make the case for the arts not merely as a reinforcement of the status quo, but a potential and ultimately essential enlargement of the circumstances in which we can imagine the totality of our lives. Our artistic capacity is indeed unique to our species. To ignore or diminish it, and to ignore or diminish its development, undermines our whole being. We live in a world that faces huge challenges: exploding population growth, diminishing natural resources, vanishing indigenous cultures, increasing tribalism and bitter localised feuds, human dislocation of unprecedented dimensions, of large-scale suffering from easily preventable or treatable disease. When the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stated a strongly held view that Australia should expand its population to become a big Australia, a nation of approximately 35 or 36 million people by 2050, I think he let the genie out of the bottle. While I have no desire, particularly not in the middle of a federal election campaign, to wade into this particular debate about population or immigration, I do believe that the heat being generated by this issue at the moment needs a certain amount of perspective and clarity. Let's face it, Australia is likely to achieve something close to a population of 35 million without doing too much to change the prevailing conditions anyway. So various statements by former, current, or indeed future Prime Ministers will not change the fact that, short of a really radical and highly contentious reversal of the broad thrust of 50 years of immigration policies, a bigger Australia, if not a truly big Australia, will become a reality of some sort by the middle of the century. This is a position that is not without controversy. Critics rightly point to the fragility of our environment. Australia is the driest continent on Earth, and Australians, it would seem, amongst the thirstiest. But irrespective of one's political affiliations, the language used by all of our political leaders has been almost exclusively utilitarian. It has become a statistical narrative of GDP and CPIs, of economics and markets, of ageing and life expectancy, of productivity and competition. To be fair, it also recognises a series of profound challenges, with descriptions of urban congestion, the adequacy of infrastructure, and the impact on housing supply. However, in preparing this lecture, I read a number of official documents as well as speeches, comments, and interviews with a variety of government ministers and their shadows. I struggled to find the slightest mention of culture. So let's attempt to come to terms with the implications and effects that will not only be felt in politics or the economy, but in every other aspect of our lives, including our culture and its artistic expression. How does one begin to describe a role for the arts in light of these circumstances? What will be the influence of these likely demographic shifts on our cultural institutions? To what extent will they need to be recast to represent or reflect the evolving interests or aspirations of citizens? While English will likely remain the official language of Australia, in what ways will we communicate with each other? What music will we play? What kinds of films or books will we create to describe or define ourselves? Where will we be able to find common cause or common causes? And that all of this will be negotiated in an environment of rapidly expanding digital communications will only add to its layers of complexity and dislocation. So let's take a moment to test some basic assumptions. Australia's cultural institutions, our orchestras, theatre companies, art galleries, libraries and museums, opera and dance ensembles are all modelled upon mainly British prototypes that have evolved over the past several centuries. They really are quite young. I have no wish to criticise these institutions or what they have achieved. I would not be the person I am today standing in this very room without decisions and sacrifices taken decades ago to found a festival in Adelaide, to collect a gallery in Melbourne, or open a library in Canberra. I do, however, want to point out that every single one of these cultural institutions is a bequest from an exclusively European heritage, a rich, extraordinary legacy which deserves to be built upon and further enhanced and developed. Even as I profoundly proclaim the advantages of these cultural opportunities, I foresee some immense challenges. Without question, institutions which remain static are in danger of becoming decreasingly relevant. And no doubt many of our long-standing cultural bodies have adapted with the times. It is just that in light of some of the truly enormous shifts now being contemplated and confronted, a more far-reaching rethink might be appropriate. Let me explain why. The past millennium has been dominated by European science and technology, culture and philosophy. There is some plausible speculation that an era of European hegemony might possibly be drawing to a close. We have already begun to enter a period in history where no single culture, ideology, theocracy or politics will be all-pervasive or dominant. We are now living in a world in which knowledge comes simultaneously from various divergent technological, ethical, cultural and philosophical sources and locations. I am not the first person to detect an unusual alignment of forces at work in the world at the moment, which has the capacity to disrupt and dislodge many of our preconceptions and our perceptions. What troubles me most about such a potentially radical recasting of society is the widespread myopia accompanying it. If we are prepared to acknowledge the enormous impact of economies of countries like China or India in the next decades, why are we so tentative and unconfident about discussing and engaging with their potential cultural influence and engaging directly with it? I believe that it reflects a certain reticence about a much abused word, multiculturalism. Most of us listening to this lecture would assume that we espouse the values of pluralist liberal democracy. I find it hard not to become cynical about the way in which so much of the discourse on immigration and multiculturalism is framed. Quite frankly, this particular multisyllabic label is used to cover and to cover up a multitude of shortcomings. For I think we are incredibly loose and lazy in the ways in which we define and apply this particular word. Please do not misunderstand me. I am not arguing for a moment against multiculturalism. It's just that in its current usage, I simply don't think it goes far enough to connect to the present or future requirements of our society.